tener la oportunidad de ver nuevamente a Yves Zlotowski comentando la situación de los mercados emergentes según el punto de vista de Coface. Muchas gracias, Yves.
Thank you. So I will speak about emerging markets, and really the situation globally in emerging markets, of course, is very good, and we are pretty confident that things the end of the year or even next year will be very strong, and this is very important apparently for Spain, because as I understood this morning, there is a lot of hope that some growth will rely on exports, but of course exports in the Eurozone will not give you much growth. So, of course, export in emerging markets is really clearly will be for most of the country of Europe a key driver. On the growth, we are optimistic that there's a slowdown globally because of many aspects, but mostly because of the effects of the Eurozone, but also because of political risks in some areas, because also of soft landing in some areas like Latin America. But clearly, this slowdown is not very worrying. I mean, it's mostly some countries are going to their potential growth, so that's more like an adjustment than a real slowdown. Of course, there are some risks. I will deal with that associated with the crisis in the Eurozone. But globally, I mean, the 5% are really strong and good numbers. Globally, you just may see that in Middle East, for example, the growth is not that great, because one of the issues, of course, is that the Arab Spring clearly has also had an effect on most of the economies of this area. What are the main risks? So there is this raw material things, but I think it's not the key element. But I think the key risk clearly deals with, again, the Eurozone crisis. I think we can't stop talking about it. The very important thing, and I will come back to that, is that of course there are many channels of contagion going from Europe to emerging markets. There is the trade, of course, because some of the regions are heavily exposed to exports. They export a lot towards Europe. But the most worrying one to me is the credit channel, and I will come back to that. Another element that we see in many emerging markets, and especially in Latin America, is rising protectionism. There's this tendency now, I would say since 2008, that emerging markets now are considering their role in the global world much more carefully. And they are ready to this idea that globalization will bring them growth, will bring them everything. They have enjoyed, they've benefited a lot from globalization. Now they are going much more step by step. And you see that in many countries, they don't hesitate to take some measures that can be costly for us. You have seen what happened in Argentina, of course, a Dutch-Spanish investment. You've seen what's happening in Brazil with some taxes on imports. I think this is a trend that we will see. There has been the financial side. There has been a lot of capital control, especially after Lehman. But now I think also it turns to the real economy, and that's something that's a problem that some investors or some exporters can face in some countries. And of course there are the political tensions, but I will come back to that at the end. So what I want to speak about and focus on some minutes is the question of the credit, because but this is something that is extremely important for French banks. This is why we are so concerned about this history in France, because French banks are very, very active in emerging markets traditionally. I don't know if that's as much the case for Spanish banks. It's not as much the case for German banks. And what we see, you see, for example, the global exposure of European banks towards advanced economy and towards emerging countries. You see that there is a reduction of this exposure towards advanced economy. And the main driver being Europe. As I said this morning, European banks are less exposed to European risks. That's what I was saying, French banks getting out of the Italian risks and so on. But you also see that for emerging countries, you see a little, the last quarter's figures show that there is a little trend downward. And this is, of course, very important because, again, European bank plays a key role in many emerging regions. You think about, of course, emerging Europe. On the right side, you see the level of European banks in percentage of emerging Europe GDP, and you see it's almost 30% of their GDP. So it's a huge importance in terms of weight. These European credits in some emerging markets are important, and you see that in Latin America, for example, it's 15% of GDP. It's not nothing. So, and we saw this morning the exposure of Spanish banks toward Brazil, towards Mexico. This is quite sizable. So again, the impact of the credit and what the European banks will do in emerging markets is important. And what is the problem? The problem is not in emerging markets. The problem, of course, is in the banking sector in Europe. And what you see is that, of course, the banks have to deal with many shocks. The sovereign crisis, of course. The shortage of US liquidity, which has been also a major driver. And thirdly, of course, Basel III. And all these shocks push banks to reduce the size of their balance sheets. And whether this reduction of the size of the balance sheet will touch emerging markets, it's not clear yet. But of course, you know rumors. You hear things that you hear strategic plans of some French banks or some Italian banks. For example, Italian banks are very active in some emerging Europe countries. They are key elements. If they get out of these countries, it can have an impact, not only a short-term impact, but also a long-term impact on the growth of this country. You have to remember that 1/4 of growth of emerging Europe is explained by the growth of European credit to these economies. So this is something that is really important. Are we going towards a credit crunch? I think it's a high chance that it might happen, and it might have an impact on many. I want to stress the fact that in emerging Asia, the key element is that European banks are very active in trade credit in Asia. We believe that European banks finance something like 30% of trade credit in Asia. So they are financing exports there. And if European banks are out, that's going to be a question. To tell you the truth, these things are happening already. We see, for example, in Coface that French banks in some big contracts are not there anymore. We see Chinese banks, we see Japanese banks, we see American banks, but we don't see French banks anymore. And French banks used to be very, very active. In Middle East deals, the French banks were and some Middle East clients say, but where are the French banks? Where are they? So this is happening already now. So again, this question is a lot of worry. So I will speak about Asia, then Latin America, and then I will end with Middle East. So in China now, it's a very interesting moment for Chinese authorities because they are in a kind of dilemma, which is pretty complicated to deal with. Because on one side, there is the problem of Europe and the likely impact that, of course, Europe being a key client for China, for China's corporates, what will be the effect of the recession in the Eurozone in China? So they have the very big fear that China will slow down because of what's happening outside. On the other hand, there is another problem, is that China has to change its growth model. They have to completely adjust their model and to go from an investment, export-led economy to a consumer-led economy, and they are trying to do that for many years. So, on one hand, what should we do? Should we make a fiscal package? Should we make a relaxed monetary policy, relaxed credit to in fact, absorb the negative effects of Europe? Or should we be much more strict on financing, on budget spendings, since we have seen that if we do that, there's going to be a lot of bubbles in the economy, investment bubble, real estate bubbles. And so they are torn. They don't know exactly what to do. I think that the solution will be something mixed. And I think there will be more on the package side. I think they will help the economy because, of course, Chinese want to slow down. So when you see, oh, it's awful, China is slowing down, but they have to slow down. They have to slow down, but they want to slow down very gradually. They don't want any shock. So they will manage this gradual path, and what they will do, I think, is that there will be some relaxation in terms of credit, there will be a soft monetary policy, but not the kind of the policies that has been happening after Lehman, which has been absolutely massive, and has dealt to many problems. One of the problems you see in the chart being the debt, the local government debt, which is something very worrying. So these are the estimations, 34%. We don't really know exactly how much is it, but clearly these local governments are heavily indebted. They are dependent on the real estate. So far, what the government has done is to refinance the debt through banks. The government has asked the banks to refinance the debt of the local government, so nothing bad has happened. You know, they are very pragmatic. Of course, the temptation was to make an example, to say, okay, you local governments have done something really wrong by getting this debt, and I'm going to make one or two examples to you know, impose discipline in the economy. But I'm not sure they will do it now because of what's happening outside, so they will be very prudent. We do a survey on Chinese corporates every year, and you see this is what's going to be the main risk for Chinese economy. These are the answers from our Chinese clients. So of course it was done at the end of last year, so they are still very much afraid about the post-Lehman period, which has been very much tighter monetary policy, tighter access to credit, especially for the private sector, because the private sector in China has a problematic access to credit. But the interesting thing that is rising now is the second blue thing, which is increasing wages, because now there is lots of demands from Beijing in the region, in the local authorities, in any corporates to raise wage. And I think that has to do with the strategy that they want to promote a consumer-led economy. And this is something that in some sectors can lead to difficulties, because you have some very fragile sectors, the low added value sectors, the textile, the shoes, the toys, there has been massive bankruptcies in these sectors in the end of 2008. So these are the sectors to be watched in China. So we are confident that the growth slowdown will be managed in China, but there are still some micro risks, corporate risk in China that you have to be careful about. So on our assessment, nothing new. Everything is stable in Asia. We are still a bit worried about Vietnam, but now it's a C country. It's stable because, so maybe you know the story in Vietnam. There has been a big default from a public corporate. So these are very, very risky elements. There is a US dollar shortage in Vietnam. I would say the situation is gradually landing. The growth of Vietnam is landing a bit. So let's say that things are a little better, but there are still some exchange rate risks and US dollar liquidity risk in Vietnam. On Latin America, we are very positive. Also, of course, when you look at the growth number in Latin America, it's a bit scary because the slowdown is really, really hard, because 3.5 is not that much. And of course, Brazil has landed pretty much. Let's say it has landed a little more than they wanted to. They wanted to slow down, but they've been overshooting a bit. They're slowing down. But if the potential growth of Brazil is something like 4.5, they are under their potential growth. But it's still good. I mean, they were growing too much, and they needed this slowdown. So I think for Brazil, the growth situation is not that worrying. Of course, I wouldn't say that about Argentina. I will come back to Argentina. But globally, I mean, the slowdown in Latin America is not what worries the most. You know, the big debate in Latin America is China. It's strange because, of course, thanks to China, there has been a lot of growth in Latin America, and they've bought a lot of raw materials. But what the Brazilians said is that, of course, China is helping us, but at the same time, this is a trap, because what China buys is raw materials. And you know, Brazilians, they want to do an exporters of manufacturing goods. And this theme of disindustrialization that we talk a lot in France or maybe in Spain is also touching Brazil very much. So they are very afraid that China will turn them into, you know, a raw material economy. Now it's the first client of Brazil, China, so it's clearly very important for them. But of course, there is this problem, and you know that Brazil is a very balanced economy. They export half raw materials, half manufacturing goods. So this is something that they are very worried about, and I think it's the key for all emerging markets. You go to Asia, for example, Indonesia says exactly the same. They are very afraid that, of course, China has brought them a lot. It's a key client, but also China buys only raw materials. They are not interested in manufacturing goods. And this is dangerous. The same with Morocco, for example. China is a very important client now of Morocco. It's very important investors. But the problem is that also there is an invasion of textile product in Morocco, making the Moroccan textile completely not competitive. So there is this issue of China, competition with China, which is going to grow for me very much in emerging market in the next years to come. So in Brazil, I said they are very afraid of course, inflows of capital. They are afraid of course, and the effect on exchange rates. exchange rate real appreciation, which has an effect on manufacturing products which are not competitive. Now, you know the answers of Brazil. They are now very pragmatic in a way, you can say that. They have chosen a sort of path where they protect their industry. There's been a lot of measures from Mrs. Dilma Rousseff to protect our industry. What can I say? You know, it's of course, it poses a lot of difficulties for us, exporter to Brazil, but at the same time, you know, I think the power has shifted a bit. You know, it's very difficult for us now to have to influence these countries to say, you know, you should play the game of globalization, where we bring them a lot of problems in a way, because we bring them all these inflows of capital. We have brought them Lehman Brothers, so they say, okay, you're very nice, but now we are not completely counting on you completely to grow. So I think this debate will go on, and what Brazil has done, maybe you will see it in other countries, because this question of protectionism, I think, may rise a lot. So in terms of assessments, we are globally positive. We just withdraw the positive watch on Argentina. Argentina, of course, is going to slow down, but the problem for me relies really clearly on the business climate. Of course, there is the Repsol issue, but this is not what we rate in this assessment. We do not rate investment problem, but truly property rights issues are a problem in Argentina. The problem for us has been very simple. There has been a new law on access to foreign currency in Argentina. The Argentine government has decided to ration foreign currency to importers. So for us, we have payment delays because of this new rule. So this is the typical answers of the government of Argentina to the problems, is to have this crazy rule suddenly that everybody has to adapt very quickly. And so the business climate makes our life very difficult in Argentina, and it's not likely to change apparently soon. So this is why we left the negative watch, the positive watch. Sorry. On Venezuela, it's the contrary. Of course, I will not tell you that Venezuela is a great risk, and please go to Venezuela, because of course there is still a lot of problem. Business climate is still very difficult. There is a political risk, of course, in Venezuela. But what we had in Venezuela is that when the oil price go down, you have payment delays and payment problems. So through the KDV, way to deal with foreign currency and access to foreign currency for importers in Venezuela. So now that the oil prices are up, that growth is back in Venezuela, we see that our problems are a bit solved in a way. With these payment delays do not exist. So we feel that the situation is a little better. It's not that it's great, but negative watch means that we would put Venezuela in D. It doesn't make sense. I mean, Venezuela is not a D country. So this is why it's not a positive step. I would say that things are getting a little better. So, but of course, the rising problem in emerging markets is something much, let's say, deeper than protectionism. It's, of course, the political tensions that we see and political changes that we see everywhere. And, of course, we had Coface to adapt very much on everything, because it took us by surprise. We were very sure, especially in France, we were very sure that all these governments were stable, that there was no problem, and of course they are going out one another after another. So I think we have to completely review the way we look at emerging markets this way. And my point that I want to develop here is to say there is a profound desire to change in emerging markets because of rising middle classes. And those middle classes, they are much more demanding in terms of political rights and in terms of also economic rights. Of course, political rights, it's obvious. It's obvious that they want to participate in the future of their country. And by the way, internet has played a major role in the younger population for that. But there's also another dimension that is very important, and this is where you can compare Russia with Tunisia, is the problem of entrepreneurship, investment, small companies, and the way you grow small companies. If you used to grow a small company in Tunisia, well, you would have been, your assets would have been very quickly taken by the family of the wife, by the way, of Mr. Ben Ali. And in Russia, of course, it's very difficult to grow as a business for also many property rights issues that are very well known, meaning that your access to rising income in terms of building your own company has a lot of barriers. And that creates a lot of frustrations. And I think also it's a key element, and I think it's a key difference between China on one hand and Russia on the other hand, it's not the fact that the two are problematic democracies. It's the fact that in one economy, you let entrepreneurship grow, you let the private sector grow, so you let those middle classes grow, and the other ones, these young people who are getting in the market, if they don't have the right connections in Russia, they cannot do anything. So I think this is a key element, and it explains why in some countries people are willing to go in the streets to demonstrate, and while for the moment being, they do not. But nothing, of course, is written in that aspect. Another element that we now will take into account, I think is very important, is something that we completely ignored, and that was our big mistake, was the cultural changes. I think it's a dimension in changes that is very important. One example is the role of women. We completely ignore the fact that the fertility rate, for example, in Maghreb is the same as in Europe. And of course, it changes completely the role of women in the society. And it's not a surprise why there are so many women, for example, in demonstrations in Egypt. You know that it's a well-known phenomenon, or in Tunisia. And these cultural changes have to be watched very, very much, because we tend to think that these societies do not change. And in fact, the same with Russia. We completely thought that there was no civil society in Russia. It's not true. There are a lot of NGOs, small private NGOs in Russia that have been active for the last 5 years, we completely ignore. So we have to look at those changes, those civil society changes, because they are a key element of change and sometimes of political movement. So the very concrete consequence of these philosophical changes are very concrete. It means non-payments for us in some cases. Because again, political risk, it's not a theoretical question. It means that we've had a lot of claims coming from Egypt, coming from Libya, coming from Syria, coming from Côte d'Ivoire. So this is serious matter. I mean, in a way that it's matter for us in concrete matters. It's serious. Political changes are very serious, even more serious. And you see that we have downgraded Egypt for 3 reasons. The first one is our payment experience that has worsened. We've had a lot of claims from Egypt. The second problem is that there is a financial situation that has worsened very heavily in Egypt with a shortage of US dollars. So there is a problem with the liquidity, foreign liquidity in Egypt. And thirdly, of course, there are many questions, and of course today, you know, is an election day for Egypt. Many questions about the political scenario. There's a lot of uncertainties about whether the revolution will go really further and deeper in Egypt. But on the contrary, we have lived a negative watch on Tunisia. It's now A4 without a negative watch. There is a mistake here, I can see it. And the reason why we have left it is because first, our payment experience during the events have been very stable in Tunisia. And secondly, because there should be some growth in 2012, not great growth, but at least they will go out of recession. We expect something like 2%. And thirdly, because we feel that the political scenario in Tunisia is a little more, let's say, less uncertain than in Egypt. I think I will end it here. Thank you very much.